Here we go. Okay, well, so I'm delighted for folks to join us today, and especially for Alice to join us. I think one of the great things that I get to do when I hang out with my colleagues over in our Center for Multicultural Equity and Access and with the Community Scholars Program is that sadly we have staff turnover, which means people whom we love, in this particular case, retired, or like move on to other jobs. But then the great thing is that you actually get to sit on the search committees for the new applicants. So I'm just going to claim credit for Georgetown having hired Alice when I was really just one. There was like a whole big group of us who were part of this, but I'm just going to claim full credit, Alice, because I think it was one of our really brilliant hires recently. Alice came to Georgetown 2 years ago now, Alice, if I'm right, kind of formally to serve as director of academic programs within the Community Scholars Program. And that's, again, kind of that first gen low income program that students join us with, and we do is the Bridge program that you heard about last week. But she'd been at Georgetown before that, actually teaching with us within the same course as a writing faculty member. She taught at Howard University previously. Alice, I'm going to get this all wrong. You're like an American Studies person.
I am.
Okay.
Yeah.
So our AP US history teachers pay attention here. We've got like some, but Alice also for a number of years, I think one of the things that really stood out, actually ran a consulting firm. No, you worked.
Consultant, yes.
Consulted,
Me.
helping people kind of like encounter literature, but like within the workplace. So you can tell that story much better, but I thought it was this fascinating glimpse of like trying to help different audiences engage with literature. And although the audiences were really different, we thought that that was just kind of this sensibility about being so finely tuned, not just to the literature or to the acts of writing, but to who you were entering into that space and what you were going to make of that experience. That it seemed, I don't know, you can tell I was bizarrely captivated because I read this stuff like a couple of years ago and I still think about it. So in part of my life, I basically work for Alice because I run the science piece of the academic stuff within the Community Scholars Program through my Region STEM Scholars. So Alice is my boss, and it's super delightful to be hosting her here with us today. So, and Alice knows, she's going to probably give a little bit better intro to herself than I just did, and also maybe tell us about like a pivotal moment, or Alice.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you for bringing me on board to be a Hoya 2 or 3, can't remember how many years ago. And I will have to remember to tell you all about Books at Work, which is the company I worked for, nonprofit I worked for, where I was a consultant for them. And they've actually changed their name recently to Reflection Point, but they like have this wonderful idea of bringing literature into the workplace. So I got to work with C-suite level employees, you know, folks that were just in charge of huge corporations, huge companies, and get to talk to them about literature and how those conversations could help inform how they manage the people that they work with. It was a really great job, but a little bit off topic. So what my plan for today is to share with you, well, before I say anything, I want to preamble my words with mentioning how, you know, as a writing professor and as part of this writing program, we are wrestling continuously with how to teach writing to diverse populations without recreating the racisms and racist structures that have so long been part of the writing classroom, specifically in terms of the politics and the ugliness of teaching one vernacular or dialect as the standard one, when I think we all know it's just one that became standardized. And that is a very problematic position that as a writing program, I'm very proud that my particular program is really actively wrestling with how to teach writing in a way that is useful, that prepares students for the lives they want to lead once they leave campus, not only in terms of the marketplace, which is icky when you say it like that, but is, I think, frank talk, but also with the kind of people they want to be when they leave the university in terms of being change makers. So I'm speaking to you not from a position of authority and like, I know everything about the writing classroom, I figured it out, here's what I think you should do. Not at all. I'm coming to you from a position of constantly wrestling with and working with my pedagogy, which is evolving over time, and I'm constantly changing my mind about what's most useful to my students. So this is all just a snapshot. And what I plan to share with you today are 4 areas of difficulty or challenge that students face when transitioning to a university in general, but specifically to a place like Georgetown. And what I was pleased to discover as I was thinking about these things was that I thought I would be thinking of areas of adjustment that were specific to first-gen low-income students, but what turns out they're actually things that all students at Georgetown struggle with. How they struggle with it varies depending on their preparation and their background. Obviously, I think what's different for first-gen students is there's multiple layers of other experiences, anxieties, and gaps that inform those 4 areas I plan to talk to you about, but they're across the board are things that all students at Georgetown are struggling with. So I'm going to share those 4 things and then turn it over to you all for questions. But before I get to that, I guess I will share a little bit about myself. I am a first-generation low-income student. Well, first, my title. I am the academic director of the Community Scholars Program, which means that I create the curriculum for the writing course that the students take in the summer. And then I also teach my own courses in the fall. I teach writing and creative writing and occasionally a lit course, and they let me do it. I taught a Black autobiography course that I really loved a couple of semesters ago. So that's my resume. In terms of my background, again, first generation low income myself. Neither of my parents graduated from high school. I love to say that I was born at Georgetown and then qualify it because Georgetown Hospital was the only hospital that would accept my parents without health insurance. So I was born there, but Jesuits made it happen. I grew up though outside of DC, just outside of DC in Langley Park, Maryland, which is a self-described suburban ghetto. I went to a very rough school. There was violence there. There were shootings. I look back at the stats now, or I look at the stats of who graduates, what the SAT scores were like. I think my elementary school was in the top lowest 1% of elementary schools in Maryland. So very difficult educational experiences. And I managed to get into a tiny honors college, UMBC, with a merit scholarship that they used to give out back then. And I was very excited to come to college. I felt like, a real big shot. I was going to just wow them all with my prowess. And I get my first paper back, and it's a big old C, the only C I've ever received. And all those things you hear about imposter syndrome came, to the forefront. I was like, what am I doing here? How am I going to maintain the GPA that I need to keep my scholarship? This is a disaster. And so in hindsight, what I realized is what was missing from my scholarship, which was a great scholarship. They gave you money for books, they'd pay for you to study abroad, they gave you all the money that you wanted, but there was no community, there was no guidance or support. And I actually did very well in college. Despite that initial C, that was only one of 2 low grades I would ever get. I did really well. I managed to crack the code. And I think the reason for that was I organically developed the community that my program, CSP, offers to students. I happened to land upon a group of first generation low income students who we all really wanted to shine in the same ways. We supported each other. We rooted for each other to get good grades. We studied together all the time. And I graduated with a really, really beautiful GPA, like practically perfect GPA. But what my friends couldn't provide me, that again, my program now, CSP, does provide to its students, is they couldn't provide me with, a plan. Like, what do you do once you leave college? So I graduated with, this beautiful GPA. I had a bunch of, internships and jobs that had really lovely things in place. And then there's no idea what to do with graduation. I took I was just in this habit of collecting money, and whatever program gave me the most money, I went there. So I took on a master's program that was completely irrelevant to me. Didn't want to be there. I was in a classroom full of principals and higher ed educators, and I was 22 years old. It was not a good fit. And I don't exactly remember how it happened, but I was at my college for some reason, maybe picking up a book or doing something. And I happened upon a teacher who was in her office hours teaching a summer course. And we had an incidental conversation where she encouraged me to apply for an MFA, a Master's of Fine Arts in Writing. And that's what I did because of that conversation. And I think in hindsight, it reveals to me the power of those incidental conversations you have, and what happens when you connect with professors as a resource, what happens when you have conversation, ask questions, and plan for your future with guidance. So it's just a real joy for me now to be part of a scholarship program that provides the type of resources and supports that I was missing. It would have saved me a lot of meandering, I would say, and a lot of heartache. So that is a little bit of my background. I went on, like Heidi said, to get a PhD from the University of Maryland in American Studies. I taught at Howard for several years, which was wonderful. I also consulted for that program that Heidi mentioned, and I landed at Georgetown while I was consulting because I wanted to keep one foot in the classroom door while I went off to, make my big money in the private sector. And what I realized working with all of those CEOs and vice presidents, that I missed the actual classroom. Those conversations were fantastic and useful and thrilling in a lot of ways, but there's nothing like the magic of what happens in a classroom, as you all so very well know. So that is a bit about my background, how I got here. And I would say if there's a pivotal moment in there somewhere, it was probably getting that C on a paper and having that heartbreaking moment. So I'm going to transition now to the 4 areas of adjustment or transition that I think a lot of students struggle with. And I think it would be useful to students to have kind of the mindset, these mindsets that I'm going to attach to these 4 different areas areas of transition that are difficult for students. So the first one is students often think of college as an end point in somewhere, like somewhere where they've learned everything that they're going to really need to learn, and they're going to add on to it, right? They're going to accumulate more knowledge, more complicated knowledge. You've amassed this knowledge in high school, and then suddenly in college, you're just going to get more. You're going to build up this big pile of knowledge. You're going to sit on it like Scrooge McDuck, right? And what's heartbreaking to a lot of them is that is not the case, that so much of learning more has to do with destruction, right? That you're just going to get rid of what you thought was so useful to you, and you're going to replace it with something else. That so much of learning in college and learning in life, it's just about revamping, sometimes burning to the ground what you initially thought was so useful and effective, and replacing it with something else. And that is a process that develops over time and continues on. I often break my students' hearts when I say, the 18-year-old Alice would hate the 45-year-old Alice. The 45-year-old Alice would be an anathema to the 18-year-old Alice. And they go, how can this be, right? They've got this real commitment to learning something and holding on to it. So I would say for a lot of students, this is most evident with the 5-paragraph essay. They get very, very, they're crushed. They're like, what do you mean I'm not going to use this template? This is a useful template. This template has served me. It is a magnificent structure. I know where all the pieces go. It's very neat. They love that funnel introduction, right? Where you start really broad, in the world, things sometimes happen. And then somehow 5 sentences later, you land upon your thesis about Shakespeare. And so they really struggle with letting that go. And what I try to tell my students about that is you're going to let a lot of things go, and you have to think of them as training wheels that are useful to you in the moment, just the way training wheels are useful in learning how to ride a bicycle. But once you start really trying to go somewhere on your bicycle and be a bicyclist, those training wheels will get in your way. And the 5-paragraph essay is this set of training wheels that will really start to get in your way if you try to do college level writing within that construct. And so preparing them for letting some things go that were very useful to them, and trusting that what they learned from the 5-paragraph essay, the importance of a structure, the importance of having things move in an order, that is what's useful about that template, and not being attached to that template so much. So that's definitely one of the things that students, and this is across the board, right? I've had assignments with students where I will say, no one is allowed to put their thesis at the end of the first paragraph. You must find somewhere else to put it. And they will still find a way. Like, they might break that paragraph in 2, but it's still the last sentence of the first paragraph. But so that attachment is very real. And I think what's my second point has to do with the fact that there's nothing to replace the template in college. So a lot of them will say, hey, fine, 5-paragraph essay out the window, I can cut it. Now tell me what you want to do. Like, what's the 7-paragraph essay, right? They want a format, a recipe in place, and they really, really struggle with having to come up with their own ideas. And they're very, and I can kind of remember that too, being like, wait a minute, I'm very good at book reports. I'm very good at reading lots of opinions and telling you what those opinions are and kind of aligning them next to each other. But if you want me to actually assert an opinion about those things that I've read, that is very difficult, right? Because there's no right answer there. And they are still, a lot of them are very attached to a right answer that they just want you to tell them or lead them in the direction of, and they can be very infuriated that that's just not going to happen. We read Sula, Toni Morrison's Sula last year in the summer. And, that book has been around forever, and there's tons of sources online, Spark Notes, EndNotes, all kinds of places where you can kind of, there's all the themes, all the birds, all the symbols, all the flowers, and a lot of them will bring those things forth and be like, I have found it, the answer. And they're just so frustrated that you can't just call Toni Morrison up and say, hey, what's the right way to interpret this? And they kind of want me to, they want the final answer. And they very much struggle with, there is no final answer at this level of thinking. There's just interpretation. There's just the quality and validity and evidence for your interpretation. And I really actually don't care what Toni Morrison necessarily intended. And you shouldn't either in this exercise. It's an intellectual exercise where you are interpreting something. And that's what you're demonstrating to me, not your knowledge of the correct answer. So I think we're really thinking about this actively in the summer, how to get students to really take ownership of their learning, of their thinking, that it has to be coming from within, that it's not some external source where you can find the right answer and put it in your paper and dress it up and make it very pretty, but it's really about wrestling with ideas, asking important questions, taking the initiative to seek out a unique interpretation, and really sitting with what an opinion is. I would say that's what students really struggle with is to know what it is to have an opinion, and that's all that most of us have. I actually will share something that happened last summer with a student who's a brilliant student, amazing scholar. She was writing her paper and she had read the book that came out 2 years ago, A White Fragility. And she had read it, she'd had conversations about it, and she was just ready to go. And then somewhere she had read a critique of the book that said it was censoring the wrong voices and it was actually racist. And she, bless her heart, she was such a good student, so conscientious and smart, all of those things. And she was like, I didn't know. And she's in tears and she's devastated. She's like, I had no idea this book was racist. I thought it wasn't racist. And I, I have to start over. I have to take this out. And I said, like, maybe it is racist, but do you think it's racist, right? And that there's all of these schools of opinion and thought on this one book. And some people think it's very racist and other people think it's anti-racist. And some people are sitting in the middle, and some folks have come from one side to the other and will probably go back again. That it's really okay to not know what the right answer is. You yourself have to come up with what you think is the appropriate answer for yourself. So that would be my second kind of area for adjustment or difficulty transitioning. So that would be, what was the first one? So not accumulating knowledge, but sometimes kind of destroying knowledge to replace it with something else. It's my training wheels metaphor. The second is kind of owning your actual education, that no one's going to give you a new 7-paragraph essay, that you're actually going to have to do things from the ground up based on your own interpretation. The third thing is having a mindset that's prepared for intellectual discomfort. I think and this is true for all of us, right? We get in our echo chambers. No matter what I do on Facebook, I'm just constantly bombarded with the same 6 or 7 types of ideas from the same 15 news sources. Like, it's just constantly reiterating what I already think about the world, the administration, foreign policy, environment, all of it, right? And so they're operating in those similar thought bubbles. And what I hope to help students prepare, what I hope to help them prepare to do, is to experience challenging views, not as something to overcome, but as possibilities for changing your mind, which I think we're very comfortable saying other people out there, they need to change their minds and be open to opposing points of view, but we very rarely, I think, ourselves do that work. And I think it's very important for us to model that for students, and also to encourage students to be wrong. Like, it's great. What a triumph, right? To read something that changes your mind and you go, I used to think this, but now I think that, to kind of get them to indulge themselves in terms of, I don't want to say being a hypocrite, but like changing your mind. Like, their consistency is not a goal. The goal is not to be consistent. The goal is to evolve to something closer and closer to what you think is the truth with a capital T. So we read a lot of challenging texts in the summer, things that I don't necessarily agree with, but I think are well crafted in terms of argument. And I say, no, let's confront this challenging idea, and maybe it'll change your mind a little bit. But I think letting go of pet beliefs, cherished beliefs, things that they have sort of begun to think as givens that are fixed, that are part of their identity almost, when they really are just points of view. That is also very difficult for students across the board. And I think preparing them for the joys and the pleasures of changing your mind and being wrong. I've been wrong all the time, over and over again in my life. And as painful as it is, it's often also extremely powerful and precious to me when I'm wrong about something. So that's the third area for adjustment. And the last one I will share with you has to do with the volume of reading that students are expected to do, and expected to do well, but also reading as preparation to do writing. That writing is a very difficult skill that everybody seems to need to know how to do, regardless of your field, right? So in every class that's not a strict STEM class, and Heidi, you can qualify this for me since you know better than I do, you got to write a paper. If you're not in a math, I don't even know, maybe you write papers in math, but unless you're in a specifically math centered course only, you're writing papers in the rest of your classes, right? That this is a way that you demonstrate knowledge at the university. So regardless of your field, your major, you're going to have to write. And not just in terms of the university, but you're going to have to write, emails to your future employees. You're going to have to apply for grants. You're going to have to apply for jobs and write cover letters. You're going to have to write the angry email to Amazon about where is your package. That this is a skill that transfers into any career, into any area of pursuit. And that's why we teach, it's why it's a required course, right? That writing is just something that's a functional skill that all of our students need to have. Now, again, as I said earlier, what that looks like and what that means is very contested and complicated. But I think we all can agree that writing is something that students need to be able to do effectively. And I think reading is the unsung hero when it comes to learning how to write well, to learning what language sounds like on the page. I love telling my students, I didn't get grammar. I went to a terrible school. Some people got grammar, some people got literature, never the two should meet. I got literature. I don't, even to this day, I know by ear, my ear for grammar is nearly perfect, but I couldn't necessarily break down a sentence in terms of the grammar rules, right? And so I encourage my students to read and to build up the habit of reading, like the way you do with exercise and diet, right? That sometimes you exercise as a function, like you got to get it to get your fitness in, but sometimes you exercise for pleasure, right? And the reading should be the same way, that in the same way that you eat. Sometimes you're eating something delicious because it's delicious. Sometimes you're eating something delicious because it's nutritious for you, right? But that is what you do with reading. You read for pleasure, you read for function, you read when you're bored, you read when you're happy, that you read all the time. And that this is the way that you shape your mind into the languages that we all speak when we're communicating with each other. So I have talked a ton, so I'm going to pause now for questions, take a sip of my coffee. And I also want to thank Heidi for inviting me, and all of you for making time to hear me talk at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday when we would all rather be outside, I'm sure.
Alice,
Question. Oh, sorry.
yeah, I was just going to say thank you, Alice. Gavin, please.
So literature and reading, what piece of literature would you recommend every high school teacher read, and what piece of literature would you recommend every high school student read? And I know that's narrowing down to a lot, but I love asking this question.
I'm not gonna answer that question directly. I'll answer the first part. In terms of students, I don't think anybody can go wrong reading Baldwin. James Baldwin is just maybe the perfect American writer in my point of view. He's so good that I actually don't teach him, because I feel like I couldn't teach him as part of a class. I would want to teach him maybe I should actually teach a Baldwin class. So I would say if you're going to force me to choose one writer that I think everyone could benefit from, it's a collection of essays from James Baldwin, just beautifully crafted, well argued, very sophisticated, unbelievably satisfying, very prescient, just a real savage on the page, to use some like outdated vernacular of our students. So that's my answer for students. For teachers, I know I said I wasn't going to answer, but I am going to answer. So I'll give you three. I would say my most influential, outside of the creative writing theorists, I would say number one, Keith Gilliard. He's a brilliant scholar that talks a lot about the consequences of using one or thinking of one dialect or vernacular as the standard one. I love his distinction between standard English and standardized English. This idea that, there isn't one standard, but one has been privileged above all others. And what are the consequences for students who are asked to code switch, right? Where you're like, okay, well, one language is for home and that's okay, but the other language is the proper one. That's like the one you're going to learn in school. And if you wanted to provide some pushback to that, I think Richard Rodriguez is pretty interesting. Although I don't agree with him, I think he poses kind of an interesting and valid pushback. The second I would say is you can't go anywhere without Geneva Smitherman, who was writing in the 70s in ways that we're talking about now, that are cutting edge now. This idea of assessing student language by whether it's making sense, right? As opposed to whether it's grammatically correct. So that if you're going to make an argument, did you provide examples? Did you say something logical? Did you anticipate how someone would disagree with you? That those are the things to look for primarily in writing, and that grammar is secondary, and grammar should be assessed in terms of how it gets in the way of that communication of really intelligent, well-crafted, smart ideas. And the last, you know what? I'm gonna do it right now. So this is a book that I have recently come to. It's for Sean Ashanti Young. And he is writing very provocatively and interestingly about literacy in the writing classroom, and Black vernacular English in particular, but all types of Englishes. I can't say that I agree with everything he said. In fact, I've been fundamentally opposed to a lot of what he argues, but he's convincing me. Like it's happening now. Everything that I'm saying we should do with our students, it's happening with me now. I've read about him and I was like, I don't know about that. That's not useful. My students need to know how to write in their Problem of God class next semester. I can't be wasting my time with this. And then I read something else he wrote and I was like, oh, convincing, very compelling arguments. So then I went and bought his book and I'm reading it now. So you asked me, I gave in. Those are the three folks I think that would be useful for you all to read in terms of thinking about the challenges our students face in the writing classroom.
I wanted to make one meta comment, and then I'll add a little bit to it, Gavin. One of the meta comments is I think it would be very, very startling to your high school students that Alice recommended to you a book that she doesn't always agree with.
Yeah.
My husband is an English professor at Georgetown, and he used to get critiques from some students that, they didn't think every book that he assigned was like a great book. What did he see in them? He's like, oh, I don't think they're a great book either. And they were just appalled that would be a book that would be, but he said, but they're interesting books and the ideas are interesting. And they're often like juxtaposed with some other book. But they were convinced that because he assigned them, he must love them, think they're all speaking the utter truth, not that he found it a problematic book, right? An important but problematic book. So actually, Alice, when you were just like, yeah, I'd recommend it. Like, I don't agree with a whole bunch of it. I thought, if you told your students that thin slice.
Exactly. No, I tell my students all the time to engage with viewpoints that they disagree with. If anything, just to know how wrong the other side is, so I don't think I'm shocking anyone. I'm a pretty liberal minded person. I read the Wall Street Journal. I listen to Joe Rogan. I try to engage with people who I think are smart, who I disagree with. And I think you're absolutely right. Students are often shocked to know that something is not some like precious beloved thing that I'm sharing with them. I'm also holding out to be like, what do you think? You know, what's your, and again, it goes back to the second point I was trying to share with you all, was that they are very, they struggle with the idea that there's no right answer, that, you know, there is no correct, you can't go call Toni Morrison up. What's the correct answer to this question, to this debate? What's the final conclusion? And I think this speaks to that perfectly, right? That I don't know if he's right or if I'm right or if neither of us are right. It's just a fun conversation. Not, it's a useful and fun conversation to have.
I have a couple questions for you. My first one is, I love the idea, right, of reading things that you don't agree with. How would you respond to a student who says, not only do I disagree with it, I find this author's perspective traumatic? Like, how do you respond to a student who says that?
Oh, I think that that's something that I definitely struggle and wrestle with, right? So what's the line between reading something that undermines your humanity versus reading something that challenges your viewpoint? And I think you can ask that question and trust students to make that distinction for themselves. And that distinction will probably evolve. I also like to prepare my students by saying, don't you want to know what these viewpoints are out there that you fundamentally disagree with, so that you can weaponize them? To be frank, it's really hard to argue against something that you are not familiar with. So I think that that is part of how you can kind of get in through the back door, to say, this is a pretty challenging point of view. Don't you want to know what it is? So you can say how wrong it is. And then, you know, who knows how they'll actually feel once they've read it. And it might take reading other things over time for them to revisit an idea. But I think I never want to tell a student, your feelings don't matter, but I try to tell students, in addition to your feelings obviously mattering very much, your intellectual discernment, your ability or inclination to engage with something that's challenging and wrestle with it as an intellectual exercise, I think will be useful to you as you move through the world, meet people who suck, face organizations that need to change. Everything that you're going to battle in the world as you go on to change it, it will behoove you to have intimate experience with ideas, ideologies, and people who that you fundamentally disagree with.
Thank you. And my other question is, you mentioned at the beginning of the meeting that your department is kind of wrestling with a couple topics about how to, like, what are the big topics that you guys are discussing right now? Like, what's on the agenda? And just because I want to steal them and have my English department talk about it, but.
So right now, we are definitely focusing on anti-racism in the writing classroom. So we've just been, I can give you a reading list. Sherry Lincoln, who is the director of the writing program now, is just a total G. And we meet several times over the semester. She'll give us something to read, and we will all just argue and, you know, wring our hands. And some of us are like, I don't know what to do with this. It's, you know, it's making me make choices I'm not ready to make. Other folks are like, I'm ready to make these choices, but now I don't know how to implement them. What's everybody else doing? What's happening in other writing programs? So we're really, really wrestling with, to give you a more specific answer to anti-racist work, is specifically evaluation. So how are we approaching grading? Are we ungrading? Are we doing labor-based grading? Which I am not a fan of. This idea of like how much writing you generate is how you demonstrate that you've done work. Although I will say in a creative writing class, that's sometimes how it pans out. So go figure. But thinking about ungrading, labor-based grading, and contract grading, I think a lot of professors at Georgetown are finding contract grading to be a useful go-between or step into maybe going into ungrading. But there are a lot of consequences for students at Georgetown, depending on their facility with standardized English, so that ungrading or labor-based grading or contract grading can be very useful to a student who can write the type of papers that are expected of them in their other classes. Whereas if you have the students that I work with, at least part of the time, they're missing, unfortunately, some of the nuts and bolts that they will be expected to wield in other classes. So I think there's a subset of our faculty that are really wrestling with how these ideas operate on the ground for students who are eventually going to leave this classroom and have expectations of them. And again, this book is really interesting because it talks about that very issue and that tension between preparing students, to be successful, but then also thinking about what cog in the wheel, in the machine am I, if I'm just going to reiterate or recreate things that I know are problematic. So right now the focus is anti-racist work and how does that impact grading and evaluation.
Awesome. I'm going to ask you one more question. Sorry, I just have a lot of questions, but this is really helpful. We're actually doing the same thing. We're reading a book called Grading for Equity right now. So
yeah, that's on the list.
Nice. The other one I was going to ask you, so the 5-paragraph essay, I remember Heidi talked to us about that before and I laughed. But so I want to know, do you still want it taught in high school? Like, is it a foundational structure, or is it like the potted plant that you just want to throw off the porch and like, you don't even need this, like get rid of this? Like, do you think it is the training wheels, like you have to have it to go new places, to learn to ride the bike? Or do you think it just forms a bad habit that's too difficult to unlearn?
That's a great question. That's a really good question. My short answer is I think a structure is very useful to students. If I had to be a high school teacher, I would think about how to tweak the 5-paragraph essay so it still is a formula, but it's a formula that maybe allows for more complexity. So maybe having one of those paragraphs be focused on counter argument, anticipating objections to your point of view. Maybe thinking of the introduction and the conclusion not as separate entities from your argument, but being the first step, the first thing that you want to say about your argument. So I would maybe tweak the 5-paragraph essay. I think it's time for a revamp. I think a structure is important. I think students learn a lot from structure, from templates. I use they say, I say in some of my writing courses, which you all may be familiar with, which is built around templates for helping students think through their ideas. And what's great about those templates is they'll be really simple. And you'll think a student knows what they're trying to say. And I'm like, all right, we're just, fill in the templates. If this, then that. Some people think this, some people think that, I think this. And they get lost. And these are brilliant students, but they really get lost in when they have to spell out their ideas in a logical way. So I think templates are very useful. But a more sophisticated template that more mirrors the type of writing that they would do in college or in the world, right? So even in writing an email, you anticipate, how is someone going to misunderstand me? How are they going to push back? How are they going to be like, this is suspect? What examples can I provide? What data can I provide? How can I phrase this in a way that's tailored to what I know Heidi is concerned about versus what, Dean Jimenez is worried about? Those are all things that we are practicing in in our real life writing situations. So I think having templates that mirror those habits that they will use later on, I think is useful. So just maybe tweaking that 5-paragraph essay a bit.
Thank you. Those were all really helpful. And I have an excellent English department, so I will be relaying all of this. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Emily, those were awesome questions. So yeah, I'm writing as fast as I can. So I really hope that you will go back through these, type them up, because I'm like writing and looking them up and putting them onto another screen, because we are doing the same work. And that makes me really happy that we're doing the same work.
Kate, also reassuringly, Kate, we're recording this and there'll be a transcript with it. So
perfect. Yeah, and I told a couple of colleagues of what I was going to come to and said I might be able to get you in, and they said, I am so overwhelmed right now, there's no way I can do it, but I definitely want to watch it in the summer. So I know that this will be a great resource for us to have. And just personal note, when I first started teaching AP Lang, which is the 11th grade, and I said, yeah, you're not writing a 5-paragraph essay. And in every class I had kids cry. And I was like, there's no crying in English. And I'm serious, and because you took that away from them. And then we were talking with other colleagues about that as well, that, it's just this like, high achieving kids know what works for them. And when you take that away, it's like, ooh. So, and okay, so I'm really interested in how do you set up those conversations? Like the structure of the conversations that you are establishing with these controversial issues. You're dealing with college. It's a different beast in high school. You got to control it a little bit more. in college, you're probably going to have kids that don't have the words to be able to really say things gracefully. It's far worse, I think, in high school, especially the younger you go. So I'm just interested in the parameters that you set up so that you can really get those really robust conversations going safely.
So I think that you face challenges that I don't face, quite honestly. So I am hard pressed, I think, to find solutions for your specific spaces, just because you are working with much younger students. And I know it's only, 3 months later that I get them, but it's like dog years. I used to work actually in an elementary school and a pre-primary, and we grouped the students by months. And like if a kid was 2 months, it's 3 and 2 months as opposed to just 3 years, they were developmentally in a much different place. So I don't want to prescribe anything that wouldn't be useful for you in your classroom. I will say in my classrooms, I think my approach is threefold. The first would be to build slowly, so that students build trust with each other and are get practice disagreeing with each other. This is actually what I did at Books at Work as well, where the goal was that if people in a workplace could disagree about Hemingway or disagree about the significance of this story and how it ended and who was the bad guy, that once they were able to have disagreements about this external thing, that they would be able to have more frank conversations about their actual workplace issues. So that if you could tell your boss, hey, I think the ending of that story meant this, not that, then later on you might be able to say, hey, I actually think this is the wrong way to run this machine that we're all working with in the factory, which literally actually is one of the goals of that program. So which is to say, building trust with each other, practicing with easier, smaller issues, even if it's something like, I have to be honest, actually in my writing course that I teach based on the New Yorker, sometimes we wrestle with really, really silly kind of pop culture questions, like who's the real pop princess? Is it Beyonce? Is it Rihanna? Right? And kind of forcing them into having these arguments that they may not really actually care too much about, but just forcing them into different camps, having them switch sides so they can see the validity of either point of view, or at least crafting something that incorporates the opposite point of view in a way that doesn't strawman, in a way that a person who felt that way could go, yeah, I actually, that's a good representation of what I think. Sometimes even using, and again, this may not apply very well for high school, but sometimes highly charged issues where students are very polarized, sometimes it's useful to kind of have practice arguments where you take on the opposite point of view. So say you have very strong feelings about affirmative action or about gun control or abortion, even forcing them to just play a debate team type of role and just do those and intellectual exercises where they are able to have tough conversations by inhabiting the opposite point of view, I think sets up a place where when you do encounter truly relevant issues that they can get very offended by, legitimately offended by, they've built up enough trust with each other that they can not only deal with hearing things that are troubling for them, but they are also able to view the person espousing them from a generous point of view, so that even if you and I disagree, I know that we're both just disagreeing about a thing as opposed to disagreeing with each other as beings. But that's not easy to do. And I'm not always successful. And I've left many a classroom where students felt very disgusted by what we had talked about, or were like, this is really obscene and offensive. And why is this in the classroom? And my hope is that, and this has actually paid off. I've been teaching long enough that I have students come back to me and go, Richard Rodriguez actually kind of has a point, even if they were super offended by him later, or, Malcolm X was a misogynist, but what about this, right? So I've had students come to me later, as juniors and seniors, and circle back. And you just have to be patient and, to use the cliche, trust the process a little bit.
I think I was much more likely to do that in my youth. The older I get, the more timid I've gotten. But I think that this group has emboldened me a little bit to go back and have a little bit more discernment with the choices that I make, because, you can be it was a little bit, I don't know, just off the cuff back in the day. But again, this group has, these are conversations that need to be had. And because they are hard, that is why we need to be having them in a safe space and teaching them how to do it. So love this group.
So I just want to interject actually. So there is another kind of trick that I have used when I want to have conversations that I'm very nervous about with students, which is to tell them that and to say, I like, I did this with Lolita. I still love Lolita. There's something I realized problematic about that, but I love that book. I think Nabokov's a genius. And I would tell them, there's a book that I really want to assign to students because I love it, but it's really controversial and it's considered like poisonous and traumatic and trigger. I mean, it's nothing but a series of beautifully written triggers. And I wrestle with it and I don't know what to do and I don't have an answer for it. What do you guys think, or what do you all think? And inviting them into the debate, inviting them into the conversation, inviting them. I in my creative writing class, we read so many writers that have had their Me Too comeuppance, and I go, okay, what do we do with this? It's beautifully crafted in a lot of ways. We can learn a lot from it. Guy was obviously a sexist, a bigot, an asshole, right? He's a terrible human being. What do we do with it? Should I teach it? Should I not? What do you think? And then they debate. And there's usually a healthy debate on both sides. A lot of them are like, can't we read someone who didn't grope anyone? You're really telling me there's no good writing by non-gropers? We have to read the gropers. Great point, right? And then the other side of it is, well, this is undeniably beautifully written, and how do we separate the art from the artist, and should we, and what do we, do we do this in other areas? Do we not take the polio vaccine because the man who made it is most certainly a sexist, right? So inviting them into the debate, letting them know that you're not sure, is a great way to force them to have conversations that they may not want to have and that you are very uncomfortable leading. It's just to kind of name it and acknowledge it and say, I don't know what to do about this. I almost didn't bring it up. What do you think?
I'm wondering, in your summer program that's preparing students, for writing, where do you think they are the most excited? Like, what gets them? What's the project or the writing prompt that really engages your students? And B, like, where do they find the most joy? And then the third part I would ask is like, how do you? I think it's very evolved that you think this way, but do all Georgetown professors think this way? And how do you change the structure at Georgetown to see writing as, you're not pleasing Miss Byrne, like you're writing your opinion, and you don't have to guess anymore what I want to hear. Like, I want you to come up with that. So that's 3 questions in one again, but sorry.
I may have to ask you to remind me of them. So the first one was, where do the students find most joy? I can't say that any of my writing prompts are really providing anyone with any sense of joy. I think what it does give them is an opportunity to commiserate with one another and connect with one another and feel oppressed by the prompt and the assignment together. So I think there's a sense of community around the assignments. And I'm going to pass it off to Heidi too. They're pained. They're pained.
This isn't true at all. Wait, so because Alice and I teach a lot of the same kids, right? Because they like take writing in the morning and then the afternoon they take another class. And sometimes that other class is mine. So no, I mean, they show up some days and they're like, well, I would have done my bio homework, but I had this English paper due. You have no idea how much reading and writing there is. So like there's all of that, but that's important. That's bonding. No, I think they read literature that makes them think fundamentally differently about the purpose of reading and writing. And I think they get that from like the first week of the summer program. And so I think they feel like they're drowning in the work and they're super jazzed by the focus of the work.
I will say, if anything, they are excited by the initial. So we usually start with a personal statement, personal essays. And this is where I try really hard to force them to write something different than their college application essay. So I have to lie. Like, I've read all of them. I've read all of your essays. I'll know immediately if you are recycling anything. So of course I haven't, and I couldn't recall. Well, I could probably recall now that I think about it. But so that first set of readings that they do, which are all personal essays that are, again, they're personal essays that are beautifully written, but usually a little controversial or in some ways challenging for them. I think they really enjoy that. And I think they're also very comfortable writing about themselves. So any invitation for them to talk about themselves, I think they enjoy. I think what is challenging for them is instead of just writing about themselves, is writing about an opinion that they hold and thinking about who might disagree with them and why, and writing something a little bit distinct from the biographical personal essay statement that they are so they're so good at writing that. And it is important. Telling your story and storytelling is very important, but doing something a little bit more complex with it, I think, is where they find a challenge. So to your first question, don't think they love any of the assignments that much, but I do think they enjoyed the camaraderie around the struggle with those assignments. Your second question was about other professors at Georgetown. I can speak for the writing program in the English department, which is deeply, deeply interested and actively wrestling with these issues of equity, with justice, with racism, and all the other types of identities that can get compromised in a writing classroom. So I can speak for my program specifically that they are really, really trying to think about making changes that speak to kind of the larger, broader ideal goal that we have in terms of the classroom, while also making sure that no students are shortchanged in terms of the things that they unfortunately are expected to produce in other spaces. And your last question was?
No, you pretty much got them all right. Yeah, I just wonder, like, I know for sure your writing department is super thoughtful about it, but how do you make the science department thoughtful about it? How do you make the history department, or did it, you just kind of, because I think about that, like, it's easier in a high school, we're much smaller, but I think when you're trying to scale it out, right, at a university level, how do you get all of your faculty on board with that?
So I thankfully that's above my pay grade. I will say, in terms of my own classroom, which I am very, very honestly, actively, currently wrestling with, how am I going to teach my RIT course in the fall? How am I going to adopt some of these changes that I think are vital? My plan so far, my tentative plan, as I think this through, is to invite students into the conversation to say, here's what I'm wrestling with. What do you want to learn? How do you want to be evaluated? I'm going to give you all my feedback based on the quality of your ideas, how well they're organized in terms of structure, organization, clarity, well balanced in terms of evidence and appreciation of opposing viewpoints, which I think are things that cross all sorts of writing styles and vernaculars. And then say, what else do you want? Do you want me to take a look at the grammar? Do you want me to focus on what is commonly understood as graceful syntax, or what voice or tone would you be expected to write in? And do you want feedback about that? And just, I'm sure this is going to change in the months before I get to teaching actually again, but I'm going to invite them into the conversation and see what I can manage, what I can do, what I can manage in terms of providing them feedback in at least two layers of just overall universals and quality of argumentation, what appears on the page in terms of cleverness and elegance and sophistication and logic, but then also, what grade would this paper get in a different class?
I think, Emily, one of the larger answers to your question is that I think it's schools like Georgetown, which isn't, I think, true when you talk about scale. I think this becomes less true as the bigger the scale gets. And right in Georgetown, at just under like 7,000 undergrads, is still on this. It's not tiny, but it's not like mega scale. I think for the most part at Georgetown, faculty get to, we get to like often pick some courses. Like everybody, like you've got to teach a certain amount. And if there's a ton of first year writing courses, and there are a ton of first year writing courses, then lots of people get like pulled into it and things. But we often create those courses so that faculty, even who are like, oh, I wasn't thinking I was going to have to teach this one, still get to teach their version. So the writing course, our first year writing course, has a million different versions because every professor can do their thing with it within some larger framework. We have our intro theology course, because we're Georgetown, so it's like, it's called The Problem of God. And it turns out God has like 30 different problems every semester, and sometimes the problem of God is like witches in the 1600s. And sometimes the problem of God is atheism. And sometimes it's like Buddhism and things like that. The history course, the intro history course is history 099. So the professors you folks will be working with are the ones who kind of teach within that. And they realized that they needed like a bajillion of their faculty to do it. And they were all teaching kind of a crappy job, mediocre job, sorry. No, it was a great job. It was great, just not quite up to the full standards that we wanted it to be. And instead they said, look, what we really want students to learn in that first year is like what it means to be a historian, to see events through the eyes of a historian. And so you can teach any content you want to teach, whatever your little like niche within history is, teach it. And within that context that you're super comfortable and passionate about, talk about how it is that you're a historian and how they can become a historian. And so there's guidelines around that. But it ends up, though, Emily, with a weirdly disproportionate percentage of Georgetown faculty who teach first-year students are actually pretty into the experience, and often wouldn't trade it. Like people are like, well, you can rotate out. And they're like, I kind of like my History 099 course, or I like teaching freshman writing. And so that it's not a universal panacea, but I think one of the things that we've learned is that if you allow people to teach their kind of scholarly passion and focus on these larger, deeper, shared learning goals about, don't just read about writing, be a writer. Don't just know that others critique literature. Start your career at Georgetown by like critiquing literature. That you get, students are getting more out of it, but more faculty find their footing within it in a way that a lot of faculty don't usually find their footing, especially with first-year students, right? I think that's a real challenge. So I would say, so I'm just going to add one thing to Alice's that she was saying before. One version that we have, so we actually, we do a lot of writing in the sciences, it turns out, much to students' deep chagrin, when they're like, no, professor, you don't understand. This is why I became a science person. And I'm like, well, keep looking, because like not this version of science, at least. But one of the topics that we give them, they do in their very first semester with us, is they write a research paper based on the scientific literature. And they write it about a mental health condition and the genetic and environmental bases of that. And every semester, a large percentage of students come back to me and say, I know you approved my topic, but I'm going to have to change topics. And I'm like, okay, if you change your mind, find something else. And they're like, no, I just, we don't have the answers yet to this. So I'm going to have to change topics to find one with the answers. Mm. And I'm like, no, all the conversations that we've talked about with the bleeding edge of knowledge, like, well, you're there and it's bleeding. So like, good luck with it, folks. But they're very unused to writing about things. And again, this isn't limited to our low-income first-gen college students or anything. This is just across the board. They're very unused to writing about things where they're used to them not knowing, but they're not used to writing about things where the world doesn't know.
Yes.
And they just assume they've done it wrong. And I'm like, no, that's what it looks like. And they're like, well, what do I do? And I'm like, well, did you have thoughts when reading these papers that left you hanging? And they were like, well, yes. I mean, didn't they ever think? And they'll list like 3 sets of experiments that people should do. And I'm like, well, when you're done with this paper, feel free to apply to the NIH with a grant proposal, because you have great ideas. But it's it's kind of the reflection in the sciences about what Alice was describing before, but it's not just kind of in the English classes. They're just unused to being out beyond the edges of certainty. I'm teaching seniors this spring. Alice, I'm teaching seniors this spring. I don't usually get to do this. It's very exciting. And we're talking about what they got out of a Georgetown education the other day. And one of them said, I've gained certainty about being uncertain. Mm. And I was like, that was very deep. But I think that's one of the pieces of it, that they're, and I would argue at that point that actually having some framing around the writing, and again, we don't really tell them, there's a lot of instructions. It's like a 12-page typed assignment for this paper. That's a 5-page paper on their part. So the balance is all off. But one of the things that we found is that there's a balance also between uncertainty and where you put it. So if the framework for the paper is uncertain and they're uncertain about the science because the world is uncertain about the science, that's too much uncertainty. And they kind of drown under the weight of it. And so we suggest structures to those papers, and they have the whole developmental process where we like talk through with them about what are effective and ineffective structures. Where we think they're going to be more confident about the content of the paper, we tend to be more open-ended about the structure of the paper. So I think we try to balance so that they're not uncertain about absolutely everything. And at least, Alice, I don't know what this looks like in English at all, but at least in the sciences, we try to juggle kind of the level of confidence in the content versus the structure and how loosey-goosey we go on the two sides. A common sophomore assignment we give is they actually do write a grant proposal for us, which is, I know, right, Alice, it's like a very high-end thing to do.
Right.
Grant proposals, though, in science are written like Mad Libs things. There are like 4 to 5 paragraphs on the first page. You're only allowed 1 page. It's a certain size font. It's a certain size margin. The first and second paragraphs always carry the exact same burden and task. And we talk a lot about that structure because the intellectual lift is so profound for them in literally proposing research that nobody's ever thought of to do before. And so then we're very formulaic about the writing, but we're also authentically formulaic. It turns the world is formulaic about grant proposals. But yeah, but that's kind of a trade-off for us.
I think what you're speaking to is something that I think most writing professors are thinking about, which is how writing is so genre specific, right? That even though I say, get rid of the 5-paragraph essay, move your thesis, it doesn't have to be at the bottom of the first paragraph. I also acknowledge that there are some fields where there are specific places where they want you to put things. And that part of my job in the writing classroom is to teach you to be conscious always of the genre that you're operating in, whether it's an email to a professor, whether it's an email to a company, whether it's an email to the person you're breaking up with, that there are expectations on your reader. And I come from a creative writing background, so I'm always like, the reader is paramount. It's really not about your feelings or anything like that. That goes in your journal and your diary. The goal is to impact your reader. And if your reader has expectations, if there is a genre that your reader is expecting you to operate in, then you need to adhere to that genre in a way that creates an impact in your reader. Now, of course, sometimes you push back on genre. Some genres need to evolve, or you can play with them. But I think building confidence with genre so that you can, know the rules, so you can break them, that whole shtick has a little bit of applicability here. But my job as a writing professor is to acknowledge that there are genres that I don't write in, that I don't have a facility with, but that I know that they're out there. And when you operate in them, you need to be aware of those expectations, but that there are these universals in some ways that transfer across writing situations, so that examples are almost always welcome, right? Anticipation of opposing viewpoints and skepticism is almost always welcome. A clear order, an organization and logic and flow to your ideas is universally appreciated, whether it's an angry email, a love letter, a grant proposal, whatever it is, that there is some sort of logical movement and momentum to a conclusion. I think those are the things that I try to teach my students, while also saying that's all going to look very different depending on the genre, which might be very formal and strict in some cases. Heidi, I think you were the one that told me that chemists use the passive voice and biologists use the active voice. Did I get that from you?
Yeah, this is true, actually.
Using that in classes.
Yeah, this is one of those things where I think students also believe that there's probably like either a set of, they're either believe like, why aren't we all exactly the same? Like, why can't there be one set? To then deciding that because they've heard about different things, like it just doesn't matter. And they're just going to do their own thing because like it can't possibly matter because there's so many different rules. Yeah, so biologists write first person active voice. Like that's how we write in scientific journals. And so that's how we teach them to write in our classrooms. And that fits most of your sensibilities probably. But chemistry articles are written typically in third person passive voice. And so that's how they teach them to write, because that's the authentic discipline. But you've got kids who in the same evening are both in bio and chem. And trying to obey what are kind of quite different ways of expressing yourself, right? And it sounds really different when you write in those two genres. And I think one of the things also that as we have students, and students at Georgetown write so much, is to also just respect that intellectual act that they're doing. That it's hard for them to sometimes remember whose rules they're following now. Okay? As somebody, right, as the mom of a kid who went between two houses growing up, mom's house and dad's house had different rules, and that gets complicated to balance those. And I think the same's true for writing rules. And I think that's a shift to college. There's so much more writing across the disciplines in college. I think the explosion of different genres and rules is quite difficult sometimes.
I see the time, and I texted my English department chair. I'm like, guess what I'm doing right now? And she's like, can you ask these 3 questions really quickly? So the first one is, like, your summer scholars, what writing supports do you think they find most beneficial? Do they like writing centers? Do they like office hours with professors? Or do they like peer review the best? And then as a professor, like, what strengths are you noticing the most that are most common in your students who are coming in? And do you think, is the trend, are college students writing more than they have in the last 10 years or less than they have in the last 10 years?
Okay, quickly. So the first one I would say is a marriage of peer review and office hours, which is time with the graduate TAs. So we have, typically they have been master students in the English program. This year they will be probably from a wider range of disciplines, but having a small group setting where they get to engage with someone who has a little bit more experience writing than they do, I think is most useful. I think peer review is useful, but a lot of times that is only so useful as a conversation between equals can be. I think having an outsider point of view or a more expert point of view in a small group setting is the most useful. I think that would be also maybe useful with a professor, but you lose something when you have the grader in the room. So I think having a higher, I'm trying to think of an appropriate word to use, a non-peer but non-teacher person run a small group, I think is very useful. So you get that line by line feedback, the nuts and bolts kind of granular feedback that you can't get in a classroom. Your second question was, what do I think their strength is? They come in with so many strengths. They're super smart. They're very energetic. They're ready to work. Georgetown students in particular are like 10 hot. What do you want me to do? I will do it. So that's kind of fun that you can assign something challenging and that they will figure out a way to get it completed, even if they aren't confident about it. So that I think their energy, their seriousness of purpose, I think is really charming and a wonderful quality that they all have. Your third question was, testing my memory here, your third question.
Oh, are they writing more? Like, you think the trend, are they writing more in college than they have in the past, or less, or about the same?
I don't want to answer this question. I think that they should be writing more. I wonder in some places if they are writing less, in part because of these difficult conversations that we are having in terms of assessment. And also some pushback maybe on the usefulness of writing 15, 20-page papers. Is anyone reading those 20 pages? Are they given the proper support and scaffolding to write something of that length in a meaningful way? You see a lot of students in grad school who have a lot of struggles with writing that look a lot like undergraduate struggles with writing. So I would like to say they should be doing more and stop there.
And I'll say very quickly, I think our students are very kind. They're very generous, and they're very kind to each other, to faculty. Don't really know if it's because we're Jesuit and we're just getting like the kind cream of the crop from like schools. But I am struck at how much they want to help each other, how much they want to help faculty. Like it's that's a remarkable piece of it. I think, Emily, one of the things I've seen now that I've been at Georgetown for 22 years, I think students are doing more writing in more areas on campus. I think writing is now a valued part of the curriculum in probably every single department. And our writing requirement is shared between the English department and all other departments on campus. The second required writing course is within your major. So we all take ownership of it. I do think, though, that we've are all steering away from massive papers to shorter, more pointed, more focused papers that they and we can do a better job of crafting. This is the, like, I would have written less if only I had more time, kind of, right? Apocryphal quote. So I think sometimes, yeah, I think there's, I think this is probably, I'm not sure how true it is, Alice, in the English department, but I think in a bunch of other departments, we've learned that if you actually assign half as much writing, you often get twice as much quality. So I think they're writing, probably investing the same amount of time, but in fewer pages.
Yeah, I find students are often just really conflicted with my word counts that are very small, and they often find themselves struggling to fit those. And I said, that's great. That means you actually have a really complicated idea that's worth writing about, as opposed to having this really skimpy idea that you like stretch and pull and turn into 10 pages somehow through the miracle of redundant pairs.
You take that big fat quote, you make big margins on the side. You italicize it because it takes a little bit more room. I mean, come on, I like, you know. No, the same thing's true. I mean, we set word limits that force them to make difficult editorial decisions with their ideas and their writing. And they're not used to that. I think that's a change too. I think they're just like, but no, I think you got it wrong, Professor E. Like, didn't you mean X, you know, like twice as long a limit? Like,
Oh,
I
they
got a lot
had,
of things wrong.
that's all I can say is we're all in that. And it's, I always write unnecessarily, repetitively, and redundant on their paper.
I see what you did there, Kate.
I actually have a stamp now because my hand got tired.
I love it. I love it.
When I taught high school, I taught with a colleague who used to just take entire like pages sometimes, but certainly whole paragraphs, and he would just put a big red fat marker through it and write "not needed." I never had the balls to do that, but I was always deeply admiring of it as a stance. I would write some careful long note in the margin that would basically say the same thing and just take me 10 times as long. So
I have a list of 1 to like 85. And it's exactly what I say, positive and negative, or not negative, but corrective kinds of comments. And so I literally, when I'm handwriting on the computer, I don't have to do it because I can copy and paste, but it just says number 1, and then they have to write it out because it's the same comments that I make for everybody. It's a wonderful shorthand, and they have it, and it, you know, number 7, I can tell you what it is.
See, that's the teacherly stuff that I don't have access for. That's great.
it's like fast food ordering here. Well, folks, I want to be really respectful of all of your time and also of Alice's time, but Alice and I know each other well, and this was the first year we read together admissions files. So we had a good time doing that. And don't worry, because we're going to keep Alice kind of part of us here on the Pivotal Network. We use these as like ways to like onboard people and never let them go. So anyway, so thanks for joining, folks. And we'll look forward to seeing all of you later this week, right? Okay, take care, folks.
Bye,
Awesome. This is so awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This was wonderful, guys. Thank you.